All my classmates, that I went to high school with and college, I felt that I was very fortunate to be here in the 80s because we were financially stable in the beginning of the 80s and through the 80s. In my business, we were into the mid-90s because it was had a lot of oil drilling going on, activity on the river. You had a lot of longshoreman activity on the river. You had plants that got built up between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. At one time, this was in fact the second biggest port if you could go from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, if not maybe the biggest in the world or country. So New Orleans was very vibrant in the late 70s and early 80s, but politics was always in changing, and I'm not so sure that was the result of the economics or it had any real effect on the economics. I think in some ways it had a lot of effect and it was more the state than it was than the local city issue. I can remember while the offshore oil business was booming, we represented people in that business somewhat, but my law firm was Thule, Gardner, and Waldmann. And Mr. Gardner today was a Harahan councilman and lives in Harahan, has a practice in Harahan. Mr. Thule is deceased, but was involved in living in Terrytown, which is an area that was very Irish, and most of the people that lived there came from the Irish Channel in the 60s and the 70s, and they all knew each other. They were all very close. But in that era, there was a lot of wealth in the city, and I can remember John Thule telling me that that Terrytown was one of the wealthiest suburbs in any place in the country. It was all built up in the late 60s and the early 70s, in the mid 70s, and everybody was working offshore, and it was very affluent. I remember a lot of my friends driving around new Cadillacs except for me, and they worked in the oil business, so they worked in businesses that had to do with that. And what I saw in New Orleans as far as a change in the economy was early on, if y'all can remember, in I think 73, the oil prices jumped from 33, 35 cents a gallon to 50, 55 cents a gallon. I remember the night that happened. It was on a weekend, and the prices hit all of a sudden, and I was planning on going to Shreveport where my in-laws were, and the price changed. And there was a shortage of gas. I had to sit in the car with my young son at the time, who was now 40 years old, and he was about 3 or 4. He was very upset because he had to sit in that car for 30, 40 minutes because we were in line for gasoline. And then I can remember a few, gasoline, the West Bank, that was a wonderful thing. Because as the gas prices and the scarcity went up, the drilling went up after it. So it was blow and go in the 70s on the West Bank. A lot of money. Engineers Road and Peters Road were packed with business. People had every type of service company to the oil patch, every kind of type of job you could have. It would take you 30 minutes to get off of those streets in the late 70s and the early 80s.